Bring in Matthew Deanna, a professor of criminology, law, and society at George Mason University. He's worked with law enforcement agencies and currently conducting research on predicting violence. Professor, the police in this video, I mean, you almost can't breathe watching it. They run door to door, don't have on a helmet. They know they are in harm's way, but they're running toward the gunfire. And then, as Jamal just said, the halls are empty. It seems like the school knew exactly what to do. Empty out. Don't let this person come into contact with you. In this horrible, super scary situation, did police and educators follow best practices?
From my perspective, it seems like they absolutely did. Obviously, it's difficult to follow any kind of playbook in the midst of some sort of tragedy, but I think they did the best that they could given the circumstances. And from what we've seen from prior incidences, namely Uvalde and others, they did the best they could in the time they could to minimize some of the risk.
Mm-hmm. And even in some moments, to prevent any standing around or indecision, you do even see this guy who's the leader. You know, he gives the guy a shove in front of him, like, you better get going. And it seems that they're very intent on not waiting around at all. Now, police are, I mean, they're still being kind of cagey about what the shooter wrote in what they refer to as the manifesto. You know, people want to know, why did this happen? Families want to know, why did this person do what they did? But the police chief has said a few things publicly. I'll lay them out. The school was targeted. This was a private Christian school. The shooter was a former student there. They are transgender. They had an emotional disorder. They did this based on resentment, the police chief said. So they revealed so many things except what the shooter said about why they did it. How do we go about nailing down a motive? Because that matters to this community.
It absolutely matters to this community, but I think it's important that, especially early on, no one jumps to any kind of conclusions. Partially because some of my previous research has identified that there is what I called contagion effects, which is the idea of a copycat. So in about a week to a month afterwards, you know, counties at high risk for this kind of attack are at an even more elevated risk. So the idea of trying to minimize some of that activity is obviously essential and a priority at this point. And I think over time, the nature of the investigation will reveal all of that. We've seen with previous mass shooters, whether it was Adam Lanza in Sandy Hook, Connecticut, or others, where that information becomes publicly available at some point. And it's important that the community is able to heal properly and get the resources they need. But in the immediate aftermath, I think one of their goals is to minimize the risk and proliferation of these kind of activities, because we know that the other perpetrators that are out there and potentially planning this kind of thing already are using that as reference material. So the ability to minimize that is really essential.
I see. I had never thought about that. A few speed bumps. The information will get out there, but maybe just not having it accelerate in a dangerous way. Now, I want to ask you about something because it is unique to the situation. It's also a very sensitive matter right now, and I want to treat it sensitively. A transgender shooter targeted a Christian school in this case. We have seen 3 trans and non-binary attackers carry out 3 mass shootings in the past 3 years in America. They happened in Denver, Colorado Springs, and Nashville now. The group is about 1.4% of the population, according to UCLA. And just for comparison, we've seen 0 cisgender women, 50% of the population, carry out mass shootings. So we recently had a conversation on this show about out in California, there were older Asian men involved in attacks, which was an aberration. So in this case, you see, again, an aberration. What do you make of this?
I think for starters, it's going to be very potentially dangerous to assume too much about the gender identity of any perpetrator and finding some sort of larger trend there. I think the commonality across these types of events is access to firearms, whether it be in a state that has strict firearm laws or looser regulations. But the consistency is not going to be across gender identification. I will say, though, that most of the time, an overwhelming majority of the time, the perpetrator is male. And for a location to be a place that they've previously had some sort of affiliation with is completely normal, for lack of a better term, about an extraordinary event like this. So trying to extrapolate too much about an identified gender and look for a larger pattern, I think, would be dangerous in this case because a lot of those motives wind up being very unique and specific to that offender and that community. The access to firearms is really the biggest consistency we've seen across the most significant events.
You find it dangerous to ask that question. I get, because it is quite a conversation going on online to say, that many find it unusual to have 3 specific instances, involving a group that is a pretty small group in America. To you as a criminologist, someone looking at demographics, you don't find that unusual?
What I would say is when you look at the percentage of events or mass shootings that population accounts for, it's actually disproportionately less than the percentage of the population that they make up. So I think it would be a bit reckless to draw any kind of conclusions about such a low number of events when every one of those events is going to be a unique phenomenon dealing with the victor-offender relationship, past relationships at the location, and any individual or particular motives. Again, I think the only real consistency we should be looking across when we talk about across states and across events in these kind of things is access to weapons.
That's why I appreciate having on experts who know the data. People can say anything on Twitter. To actually put it to an expert is really helpful in a situation like this. I wanted to end by asking you, there was this 10-minute or so delay in police arriving to the school. The police chief said they got there as quickly as they could. Does that sound about right to you?
So most of my research has been historically focused on some of the particulars of where events occur in terms of the community factors associated with them. I haven't done a significant amount of research on specifically law enforcement response times, but I would say that given some of the anecdotal evidence from before, that's not entirely surprising. Obviously, we'd hope for a faster response. I think some of that can be dictated on whether or not a school has an embedded law enforcement presence, like a school resource officer, but I don't know the particulars of the event that played out in Nashville, so I can't really say for sure.
Matthew Deanna, professor of criminology, law and society at George Mason University. I appreciate you having some tough conversations with us because, so many people feel so passionately, and to actually get, hard data, science-driven, that's what we try to do on the show. Thank you. Coming up.